Welcome back, everyone. Now it's time for a presentation by Lena Halldenius. Lena is professor of human rights at Lund University. She is specialized in political philosophy and early modern history. She is renowned for her for her work on Mary Wollstonecraft, and notably the book Mary Wollstonecraft and Feminist Republicanism. In the book, Wollstonecraft serves as point of entry for a loyal critique of the limits of republicanism as regards to gender, property, and inequality, which subverts the ideas and rights that republicanism professes. In particular, we would like to highlight Lena's contributions to the themes of modern republican thought and the concept of freedom. After the presentation, we invite John Milbank to present his reflections. Thus, I now leave the word to you, Lena.
Okay, thank you very much. This has been a really good morning so far. And I would like to thank the organizers for inviting us all to this, for inviting me to it. It's an honor to be included. And I think that this symposium is one indication among many that interesting things are happening in human rights, that we have turned interesting corners and are doing really rich and constructive work is taking place. So I teach human rights philosophy at a cross-disciplinary human rights program. It's a very different experience teaching philosophy to human rights students rather than to philosophy students. It's much more fun, I can tell you that. I will also throw in my usual caveat at events where words like past and present are in the title. I'm not a historian, even though I work at a history department. I'm a political philosopher, roughly trained in the analytical tradition. To the extent that I deal with the history of human rights or human rights in history, as I have done quite a lot, as you just heard, it is the history of human rights as an idea in political and moral thought, or perhaps the place of ideas like that in the history of political thought. So this talk will be sort of roughly in two parts. I will begin by saying a few things about how human rights as an historical idea in then largely analytical political philosophy and what I take away from that. In that process, I will talk critically about what I see as a curious obsession with moral foundations in human rights philosophy and how these play out both in history and normative theory. So I will use history to implicitly argue for what we can refer to as a philosophy of human rights without foundations. And I will try to explain what I mean by that. In the second part, or what is sort of roughly the second part, I will sketch some ideas for how I think that philosophy of human rights needs to be done or redone in order to be a relevant and potentially action guiding analytical tool in our unequal world. I will suggest that human rights philosophy needs to rethink what it is to be egalitarian, and that it should stop its preoccupation with the human person as a kind of moral foundation, and that instead the focus should be on political and empirically informed analysis of the circumstances in which issues of human rights and rights claiming appear. We heard Igor earlier this morning referring to John Rawls's circumstances of justice, and I will have reason to do so as well. I will not talk about republicanism or neo-republicanism, but the way that I analyze questions of freedom in terms of rectification of relations of domination will certainly hover in the background. First, sort of a kind of a programmatic stance. I agree with philosophers like Jonathan Wolff and Sally Haslanger and many others, that it is the job of political and social philosophy, also for us analytical philosophers, to not to sound pompous or anything, but to side with the disadvantaged and to be a resource for social and democratic movements, that there is no impartial position available, even though many analytical philosophers try to carve one out. It is either that or to philosophize in support of the status quo, and I think that too much human rights philosophy does that. Not intentionally, perhaps, but with that effect. So first a bit about history and its use in analytical political philosophy. It has always struck me as interesting that when philosophers work with human rights, rather than related value concepts like freedom or justice, they are more prone to invoke historical precedents for their own views and ideas. So philosophers in the analytical tradition, to which I then roughly belong, usually don't do that. They usually do not use history as one of their instruments. But there is something about human rights that prompts them to do so in a particular way, which is to use historical precedents of some kind as an argument in favor of the philosophical position that they themselves defend. One example among many, perhaps one of the most clearest examples of this pattern, is the moral philosopher James Griffin, who in his book on human rights claims that our concept of human rights, and our concept is invariably the concept that the philosopher himself favors and defends, is a product of 18th century Enlightenment philosophy, and he insists has not changed since then, thus implying that our concept, that is his concept, rests on long historical authority. Now there is a kind of a mutual feeding ground here, where history of human rights and normative philosophy about human rights have sort of shaped each other. And the direction that this has taken has, in my opinion, been detrimental to both. And I will now try to be a bit more specific about what I have in mind and provide some thoughts about what I hope that we can do instead. Now, of course, and inevitably, history is not a neutral terrain. As E.H. Carr famously said in What is History in the 1960s, facts speak only when the historian calls on them. And what becomes a historical fact, rather than just facts or stuff that happened, is constructed in the process of writing history. The Carr's point is that which facts are given the floor in history writing is inevitably a decision and not a discovery. And it's a decision that will be shaped by whatever it is that the historian wants to show and finds to be significant for showing that. And this is not critique, this is just a description of how things go. So the use made of history in human rights philosophy and what gets to be treated as historically relevant facts will both reflect and shape what human rights are conceived to be. So history will be selectively used to support one's own conception, and that conception will then be projected back onto history, thus reinforcing that these facts of history are the historically relevant facts for human rights. Now, the way I see it, the history philosophy interdependence has been played out to reinforce a philosophical conception of human rights that might be morally coherent, but is to a large extent politically useless, and in our time serves to justify rather than contest inequalities. So philosophers aren't always interested in analyzing ideas in their intellectual context. And there is, I find, a lack of understanding and perhaps even a lack of respect for what the political struggles have been around ideas of human rights. And whether the interesting and philosophically useful history of human rights as an idea is an Enlightenment-inspired ontology of what characterizes the human person as a moral agent, or if it's a history of political resistance to subordination, struggles for shifts in the balance of power, claims against power as arbitrary imposition, is an open question and will be set by whatever service you want history to do for your theory of human rights. So proceeding from this sort of hunch that we write history of human rights so that it supports our own philosophy of human rights, we can note that human rights philosophy in our time tends to focus on these two questions. The first question is, what is the moral foundation of human rights? And the answers to a question like that tends to be about the human, which in the context easily translates into a moral notion of personhood and what it is about the human person that grounds rights. And I will say a bit more about that in a second. But only for now to note that this revolves around an understanding of the human person expressed in moral terms of reason or dignity or perhaps interests. So that was the first question. What is the moral foundation of human rights? Now, the second question is, what are human rights? And what objects of moral or political relevance count among them? So, in other words, what is the concept of human rights and what is the extension of the concept? So what things in the world does the concept of human rights, thus understood, point out? And answers to this sort of double question can revolve around things like, well, things are human rights if they are of pressing international concern, which is what Charles Bates would say, or that human rights is whatever is required to live a human life of some worth, and then we can debate what that is and what a decent level of a valuable human life is. And this is the kind of discussion that we see in Martin Nussbaum and many others. And now the answer to this second question, what is human rights and what human rights are there, will typically be restricted by the answer to the first question, such that if the answer to the first question is that the moral foundation of human rights is the moral capacity of human persons for reason and empathy, let's say, then the answer to the second question, what are human rights and what human rights are there, would be that the concept of human rights refers to whatever is required to protect human persons, specifically in that moral capacity that provides the foundation for human rights. And that then will be extended to a list of goods. And that can be a familiar list of goods, and then we can debate on what objects should be on that list: freedom of expression, education, etc. That the human person conceived morally in this way needs in order to flourish. And then history becomes a genealogy of that. So philosophers of human rights, political philosophers of human rights, have tended to be pretty obsessed by the foundation question. There is a big fat volume from Oxford University Press called The Philosophical Foundations of Human Rights from 2015. It's very good and very interesting, but it is really an example of this. It focuses on the human person as foundation and how this human person as foundation in human rights plays out in two different ways. And how these two different ways in terms of how human person as foundation plays out, I think speaks to a development in human rights discourse, which we started to hear a bit about in Jessica's commentary to Igor's discussion before, about the relationship between political and civil society and the national and the transnational in a very specific way. Okay, so the first way in which the human person, or the human as foundation, plays out is this. So the human in human rights philosophy really is a shorthand for a set of moral characteristics that can be reason, moral bearing, capacity for empathy, dignity, etc. And this is, of course, intended to be at the same time inclusionary to include all humans in the kind of ontology of the human person, and exclusionary, so no non-humans. But do note that this human person looks like a kind of a moral aristocrat, a person of dignity who stands up straight, looks others in the eye, and has a conception of the good that informs their life plan. And a conception like this proceeds from the human person as an apolitical carrier of moral standing, or a self-validator of claims, as John Rawls might have put it. And human rights then are the politically and institutionally pre-existing moral claims that each person has to whatever there is ethical reason for this moral carrier of claims to value most. Now, there is also importantly a subjectivism in human rights language, and by subjectivism I mean that human rights are said to be something that persons have, and this is to a large extent taken for granted, and it accounts for why this feature is put as an ontological claim. So human rights exist or inhere in persons conceived in this way. Well, if this is the human person in human rights philosophy, then the historical and political fact that women or people of color and various minorities have been excluded from the circle of rights holders politically as well as philosophically will then come across as some kind of intellectual mistake that proponents of human rights has been sort of wrongly assuming that these people do not possess the requisite qualities, and if we only set them straight, they will realize their mistake, and we can add these groups to the concept and mix. There is no problem with the idea itself. I'm not saying that there are huge problems with this idea, but I think that we need to look at it critically because this creates an image of the rights bearer as morally and intellectually robust, autonomous, and capable. And it is this robustness that is made into the protection-worthy feature of the human. So the orientation in terms of what a human right is, the answer to the second question, what the limits are, and what makes human rights important will be settled by that image, by what that person needs and values. So if this moral aristocrat sets the tone for what human rights that matter most, then perhaps we do get the fact that political liberties and protection of property will be valued over things like regulation of working hours or a right to unionize. And Griffin is also an example of this, but as is Martha Nussbaum, Jeremy Waldron, and a whole host of others. And anyone who would like a reading tip regarding the politics of the human, I recommend Anne Phillips' recent book on the implicit biases in the falsely inclusive conception of the human. Okay, so that was one way in which the human as foundation plays out in human rights philosophy. There is another way which serves as a partial corrective to the view I just discussed. And we can see it in the discussion about sufficiency and decency levels. And it proceeds from the realization, which of course is quite apparent, that regardless of any moral capacities that we possess, we are also as humans socially vulnerable. So if human rights then proceeds from the notion of this moral human as not only morally capable, but is also socially vulnerable, that partly accounts for the shift that we also talked about earlier this morning of a focus or an emphasis moving from political rights to socioeconomic rights as necessary material circumstances for moral agency. And of course, this has been repeated many times, it's not easy to exercise your moral autonomy if you lack food and shelter. So conceptions of the human are crucial also in this discussion of the social vulnerability of the human as kind of a foundation for human rights. But here the human appear as being rather than as person. So food, shelter, etc. enter human rights theory as socioeconomic rights because we have material and social needs as beings, and these needs condition our moral agency as persons. So what is socially and materially claimable will be determined by ideas of what I need as being in order to function and develop as person or moral agent. And without giving too much of a role to how analytical political philosophy shapes our perceptions of the world, but I think that this does serve to partially explain how accounts of socioeconomic rights have come to concentrate on sufficiency levels or satisfaction of basic goods or needs. So what does a human being need in order to live a decent life by human standards? And then we can talk about the decent lives. What is the decent minimum? Is it $1 a day or is it more? And this has become even more prominent as human rights discourse in the last decade or so has semi-merged with discourses of development and humanitarianism. And this has been going on for a while, and it has been accelerating with the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And I will return to that. So this development of socioeconomic rights as sufficiency for the human as being has been rightly criticized by many people, including, of course, Sam Moyn in his book, Not Enough, in 2018. And one worrying consequence of the merger of rights and development discourse in this way is that the distinction between rights and charity, or rights and aid, and the gift paradigm is thereby softened. And that distinction was crucial for the conception of the human as person. That was the other approach to a foundation of human rights. So the human as being and the focus on sufficiency softens the distinction between rights and charity. And this is sort of promoted in development discourse. When the human rights project risks being swept along in a politics of aid with political pragmatism cloaked in rights language, ineffectual rights language as the result. I think that there is some kind of an irony here, that there's a scare of human rights inflation. And this has been discussed for several decades now. And the critique that human rights have expanded so much that they lose their bite and meaning. And expanded, I don't mean they've expanded in the actual world, they certainly have not, but expanded in human rights philosophy so much that they lose their sort of unique standing as being of pressing concern. This is the discussion about manifesto rights that many will be familiar with. But this scare of a human rights inflation has come to serve as legitimation of a human rights deflation, such that human rights or socioeconomic rights risks becoming whatever the poor can hope to expect by the grace of the rich and powerful. Okay, so far that this can sound quite cynical, but to an extent I think that this is an effect of the fear in human rights philosophy of being charged with utopianism. That's the worst thing that you can be, is to be a utopian. And this is manifest, I think, in an incongruous tendency of then morally basing human rights on a philosophy of the good human life, while at the same time restricting the political implications of what human rights require to basic provisions of life at sufficiency level, or threshold level, or decent minimum, or basic goods, or whatever you want to call it. And Martha Nussbaum is an example here, as is Tomas and many others. Thus, it seems to me that philosophers become sort of the gatekeepers of the modest requirement, trimming conceptions of what human rights are and what human rights there are, in order to make the satisfaction of them feasible and possible without fundamental revision of the actual setup of the political world. This is a substantial difference from conceptions of justice. Using the concept of justice, I mean, look at John Rawls' The Theory of Justice, which is certainly abstract example of ideal theory, but is in a sense also quite profoundly utopian. You don't see that similar kind of critical intervention in human rights philosophy as it has been largely been done in analytical political thought. Okay, so, but the idea behind this sort of resistance to utopianism, I don't like the word utopianism, but it's what we got, I'll use it, is of course not difficult to grasp. So in Nussbaum's words, the language of human rights should tell people, quote, that we are dealing with an especially urgent set of functions, unquote. And there certainly is a case to be made in favor of a sense of urgency. But what is included in that theoretical minimum, the decent level, the sufficiency, and hence in the human rights concept or the extension of it, will itself be a theoretical construction, a result of assumptions and judgments fed into it. Okay, so I have said that human rights philosophy concentrates on these two questions. First, what is the moral foundation of human rights? And second, the two-pronged question, what are human rights and what human rights are there, the concept and the extension. Now, this could come at the expense of a prior question, and that prior question could be, what are human rights for? What is the point of invoking human rights rather than, or perhaps alongside of, other normative frameworks? Well, if the point is the moral defense of a dignified human person, then you'll get one kind of history and one kind of theory. If the point is the granting of subsistence to the weak by the grace of the mighty, then you'll get one kind of history and another kind of theory. But if the point, let's say, instead is freedom from and resistance to subordination, if the point is substantial equality and self-determination and the collective power to hold politicians to account and to get rid of them, then you'll get another kind of history, but you will also need another kind of theory. An emancipatory, egalitarian, politically radical theory of justice that challenges existing institutions rather than it just makes them. So if your position is that the point of human rights, the answer to that prior question, is the rectification of subordination and vulnerability through political design, and not securing to each person enough goods for a decent life, well, in that kind of history that you will then be interested in writing, of course, the late 18th century revolutionary period will clearly be crucial, but equally crucial will be the history of social movements, the labor movement, abolitionism, and of course, the history of feminism. Not necessarily because of the conception of the human person, but for how challenges to systems of power animates intellectual and political pursuits of substantive equality. Now, if you analyze, say, freedom by not only asking what is freedom, but by first considering the question, what is it like to live under someone else's thumb? What is it like to be dependent on someone else's arbitrary will? What is it like to be vulnerable to harm without having any resources of contestation? Then you will need something else than the standard modern concept that freedom is the absence of interference. Okay, so developing a philosophy of human rights for which that is the history is a big task. Here I will sketch a couple of things. I said initially that human rights philosophy needs to rethink what it is to be egalitarian, and that the method for doing human rights philosophy needs to be more empirically informed. I will now specify a couple of things by talking about how human rights theory needs to be a form of systemic theory of justice, and that we can see how, by recognizing that non-fulfillment of human rights crucially includes not merely violations, but precarity. Okay, so if the question, what are human rights for, is prior to the question, what are human rights and what human rights are there, then of course you might think that an even more prior question is, why bother with the idea of human rights at all? Why not just theorize injustice, inequality without invoking human rights? You can do that, no problem. But I think that we should retain the notion of human rights, and my answer to why has one pragmatic and one theoretical component. A pragmatic concern is that the language of human rights in politics is at risk of being co-opted by the sustainable development language. Now, we're all for sustainable development, but the specific form that this has taken in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development is problematic for the status of human rights in the world, particularly at this moment when nationalism and authoritarian politics has weakened the standing of political and civic rights in the world. So the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development does state in its preamble and declaration that there can be no sustainable development without a universal respect for human rights. And it is sort of taken for granted that securing sustainable development is at the same time securing human rights. Yet none of the 17 sustainable development goals, nor any of the 179 targets of the agenda include democracy. And the 3 dimensions of sustainable development, environmental, social, and economic, exclude political and civil rights and make socioeconomic matters into politically negotiated goals, not claimable rights. So in the development agenda, there certainly are duty holders, governments, and global partnerships between governments and other stakeholders in the civil society and the commercial sector, but there are no rights holders. So if Agenda 2030 expresses what human rights now are in the global discourse, then there certainly is work for human rights theorists to do and resistance to put up. Now, a sort of theoretical reason traveling alongside of the pragmatic one that I just talked about for retaining human rights as a concept in political theory is that there is and remains an important difference between regarding people as rights subjects and treating them as rights subject and regarding them as objects of policy, development policy or welfare policy, however well-intentioned. And that there is some value in the modern orthodoxy that human rights correspond with obligations, so that human rights to something correspond to an institutional obligation to secure that something. This relation is basically the form of deontic logic, and it is what we mean when we stress that human rights are claims. We need to think closely about what we mean by that and how that plays out, but that form is important. It is important and importantly different from a charity or gift paradigm. It does come with challenges, though. So the deontic logic of the rights obligation correlation can, and to an extent does, skew human rights philosophy towards action, intervention, and infringement. So the question becomes, has the correct agent done the correct thing or not? And what we risk losing sight of are the background conditions of exposure and vulnerability. So I suggest that we should keep the rights obligation a correlation, but while trying to skew it towards recognition of vulnerability and exposure by making this correlation empirically informed and systemic. And I'll start with this important, I think, insight, which we do see in human rights theory, that for someone's human right to something to be fulfilled, access to it needs to be secure. Right, so what does that mean? Well, if for access to something to be secure, it means that it can't be taken away from you randomly. So if lost, there's an institutional way of claiming back that you can access. So we can take housing as an example. So even if I do have somewhere to live, my right to housing is not fulfilled if I am vulnerable to or exposed to the risk of becoming homeless in a way that I cannot control, say through the whim of the landlord or through an increase in rent due to luxury renovations that I don't want. So my right to housing can be non-fulfilled or violated, even if I do have a house to live in. Similarly, the right to food can be non-fulfilled or violated, even if a person does have enough food, but holds it as a matter of charity or luck, rather than as a matter of a workable regime for food security. So introducing vulnerability and risk into the question of what human rights non-fulfillment is absolutely crucial. And the implications are important for how human rights should be conceived, shifting the emphasis, not taking the emphasis away, but shifting the emphasis from acts and direct interventions to exposure and vulnerability, or as we can also call it, precarity. And I also think that vulnerability or precarity, rather than outright violation, is often closer to people's lived experiences of injustice. So if we ask the similar kind of question that I just asked about freedom, not only what is freedom, but what is it like to live under someone else's arbitrary will, we can ask the same question here, not what is human rights non-fulfillment, but what is it like to live in a situation of precarity where what you enjoy now is insecurely held and can be taken away without you being able to do anything about it. And how secure I am in my access to somewhere to live, if housing is our example, will be a function of systemic factors, like how is the housing market regulated? Is there a cap on personal bank loans, keeping house prices from soaring? Can a landlord increase rents at will? Is there social security schemes that save people from losing their home if they lose their job, etc.? So if you want to assess the non-fulfillment of the right to housing, the answer is in such systemic factors, not in a head count of the homeless. Now, if human rights non-fulfillment is theorized in terms of precarity, it is a good framework for addressing questions of socioeconomic inequality from within the political world. So, of course, socioeconomic inequality is not only inequality of stuff, it is a politically enforced infrastructure that either creates and upholds precarity or secures against it, depending on institutional design. Now, if you are not only poor, but poorer than others in your society, your capacity to influence the society you live in will be subordinated to the greater capacity of those who are above you. So socioeconomic inequality, and not only lack of basic goods, infringes the political rights of the relatively poor. Earlier, I criticized human rights philosophy for its focus on foundation. how a moral notion of the human person provides the foundation for human rights, making disagreements over human rights derivatives of disputes over what is most morally significant about human persons. So another option is a human rights philosophy without foundations, or at least without that kind of foundation, where we proceed from a political analysis of the circumstances of inequality and precarity in which issues of rights arise. And now I will come back to the circumstances of justice that I mentioned in the beginning. So famously, political philosopher John Rawls said that questions of distributive justice arise in the circumstances of justice. And this is an idea that he borrowed from David Hume, that there are circumstances that need to be in place for issues of justice to arise. And the issue of distributive justice arise in circumstances of scarcity, where there aren't enough resources to go around. Because if there are enough resources to go around to satisfy everybody, then we don't need to bother with questions of what distribution need to be like in order to be fair. But saying that the circumstances of distributive justice are scarcity is not particularly helpful, since scarcity itself will be politically produced through distributive and normative schemes. So food is a scarce resource in the world, not because of a general lack of food, but because of political arrangements, lack of will, corruption, conflict, etc. So the circumstances in which normative questions of injustice, including distributive justice, arise will themselves be exactly that, unjust. The discourses of justice emanate out of experiences of injustices that already exists. There is, as the saying goes, turtles all the way down. But we kind of see what Rawls means, that normative questions of political value need to be apt to the circumstances that give rise to them. And questions of human rights and rights claiming do not arise because of a moral ontology of human persons. They arise out of circumstances of injustice, including structural injustice. The structural injustice, let's assume, is a set of political and social conditions that systematically disadvantages some people or members of some social groups relative to others. It involves resources and actual opportunities, but crucially, structural injustice also involves generally diffused norms, habits, and assumptions that form background conditions to institutional rules and to action. And injustice can be the outcome, then, of rule following, informed by attitudes and norms that are generally accepted. And theories of justice need, in that case, to be apt for critically evaluating also such background conditions and how systemic relations systematically and disproportionately harm some people while favoring others, regardless of whether harm is intended. Analyzing injustice in this structural way is integral to feminist theory and can be to human rights philosophy as well. And thinking of non-fulfillment of socioeconomic rights in terms of precarity is one way of doing that. Thinking of political rights, such as the right to free speech, in terms of how social norms and epistemic practices serve to silence some people because of their social position, or make their speech ineffective because of low epistemic status, is another way of doing that. So you can be silenced even though you can speak if your social position means that there is no uptake, you are not credited as a knower. So these are not foundations really, they are normative commitments to structural justice and a requirement that theories aptly address them. So given that those kinds of commitments, socioeconomic inequality and not only sufficiency or basic goods will become human rights concerns. We know as an empirically researched fact that socioeconomic inequality shapes not only opportunities, but social norms and persons' perceptions of themselves. It inhibits equal political participation, bolsters inequality of powers, feeds corruption, skews representation and accountability, breeds social problems and public ill health, and it does so regardless of whether basic goods are satisfied. Practical capacities are inhibited by social and normative hierarchies and customs and habitual behavior that mark some people as less worthy of concern, as well as of a voice and a decent wage. The socioeconomic inequality, and not only economic deprivation, is a reliable indicator of inequality of political and social status. Okay, so I talked about structural injustice and systemic relations. These are no mysterious phenomena. We can exemplify with an easy to grasp insight from welfare theory. The importance of welfare politics to account for so-called social determinants. And the classic example is health. So what does health require? If you want to diffuse health in the population, what does it require? Well, it certainly requires access to health care, but many factors that influence health have nothing to do with healthcare, but with other things like working conditions, insecure housing, poverty, low education, anxiety for your life prospects, subjection to derogatory social attitudes, and so on. All of these things influence health. And public health research suggests that there is an empirical link between also health and socioeconomic inequality. It's not only being poor, but being poorer than others is detrimental to health. Now, these all make up the social determinants of health. And applied to human rights thinking, it means that a right to health includes a right to secure housing, good working conditions, restriction of socioeconomic inequality. We can easily generalize this, I think, also to other rights, including political rights, like a right to free speech. A right to something includes a right to the social determinants of that something. Now, these are empirical, sort of inductive insights into how structural injustice works that give us reason to accept that non-fulfillment of human rights includes precarity, and that fulfillment of human rights includes rectifying background conditions that function as social determinants of whatever right is in focus. So a human right to something includes a claim to the social determinants of that something. And socioeconomic inequality infringes human rights to the extent that it impacts on those things, which it does. So to reiterate and wrap up, I have used history to implicitly argue for a philosophy of human rights that does not proceed from a moral ontology of the human person as a foundation. I have suggested why the idea of human rights and the human rights subject is needed in a world of politically negotiated goals, and sketched some thoughts for what human rights philosophy need to account for in order to be a relevant and action-guiding analytical tool in an unequal world. And that's it.
Thank you, Lena, for this rich presentation. In that case, we hand the word over to you, John Milbank.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you very much to Lena for a complex, very, very interesting paper, raising an absolutely huge number of questions across a broad field, and I'm having to instantly try to summarize what you're saying and work out some responses with scarcely an interval to gather my thoughts. So please try to allow for that. I think that I'm in a strong measure of agreement about some of your suspicions and the questions you're raising, and I think I've got some questions about exactly what your solutions to all this really are. On the question of the relationship of philosophy to history. I mean, I'm not an analytic philosopher, so I strongly think you cannot separate philosophy from history ever. So, you know, if analytic philosophers are talking gaily about the human person, this is meaningless unless we know historically where the concept of the human person came from. And indeed, that would include all the political circumstances that gave rise to discourses about persons. So I absolutely agree, and I totally agree that the danger with analytic philosophy, when it does appeal to history, is that it's appealing very selectively to certain facts, not to others, because I think it's not attempting a kind of comprehensive genealogical approach of the kind that continental thinkers more tend to undertake, but certainly Samuel Moyn has tried to undertake, and Dan Edelstein has recently tried to undertake as well. So I think that's sort of raised the game of the whole debate. Now, in relation to your question, though, about, you know, should we be deriving our discourse about human rights from a moral ontology of the person, then I suppose the question I would put is, don't we need to historicize further what all this thinking about the person is? You know, there's one source is certainly something like Kant and the dignity of the human person as the possessor of freedom. And that can certainly give rise to an idea that we are naturally the possessor of rights. And this is thinking in terms of a sort of the independent, autonomous, free individual. But of course, in the case of both France and America, in fact, a whole politics was built exactly upon that kind of naturalism. And if you're talking about that, then I totally share all your suspicions. And in particular, I think you're absolutely right to say, you know, is it enough to say, well, women also need rights, Black people also need rights, disabled people also need rights, if, as you put it, the very paradigm of what a right is looks suspiciously, in your terms, aristocratic. I'm not sure aristocratic is exactly the right word, but nonetheless, let's say something like what has historically emerged as an autonomous male white human being. Yeah, that's right. So is it necessarily a good idea that we're simply asking all sorts of other groups to buy into that discourse? And I think politically you could be suspicious of that from both the right and the left in a certain way. And I think if you're coming from the left and you're looking at things like third wave feminism or Black Lives Matter and so on, you know, the worry could be that, you know, progress is only being made in terms of new groups entering into the capitalist market and establishing, you know, we're getting a more diverse players within law and business, etc., etc. And this is perfectly compatible with actually the continued oppression and marginalization of just those groups. And so at that point, exactly, the question could be, is the extension of this paradigm of the free, autonomous individual, is that the right way to go? But then I think that the question I would want to pose is that the only way to think about the human person? And as Samuel Moyn and others have pointed out, in fact, you know, for good or ill, a lot of our modern discourse about person and dignity is not really deriving from a Kantian source, but often from Catholic sources, sometimes neo-Kantian sources, sometimes also indeed Jewish philosophical sources, where the idea of the person is not so much a free self-owning, not a kind of possessive individualism, but much more a sense that there's something inherent to the human person as rational, as willing, as embodied, as relational, that is somehow kind of sacred. In other words, it's not simply a respect for human freedom. It's not simply a respect for, it's not simply a matter of ensuring that human beings are comfortable. It's something about the very fact that human beings are conscious, moral, reflective, self-aware, that makes them somehow unique and worthy of respect. But I think if you track that kind of thing, you know, back through the Middle Ages, Aquinas, and then back to Plato and Aristotle and so forth, you know, there could be a question about whether that's an apolitical idea. You know, that if we're talking about an ontology of the person, this isn't necessarily apolitical. If, for example, if you've got the idea that Aristotle's idea that man is a political animal, and therefore he can only fulfill himself as a social being, as a relational being, through something like the polis, through something like political participation and sharing, then I think you've got an ontology that's political as much as it is moral. So, and I totally agree with you that really what sets off debates about justice and about rights tends to be something, a matter of crisis and something negative. But I suppose you could argue that, you know, precisely when Greek democracy ran into crisis, something like political philosophy was born. In other words, I can't quite see why you want to sort of create an opposition between, you know, having a critical starting point rooted in empirical circumstances. Absolutely, yes. But why a duality between that and having some sort of moral philosophy? So that, you know, you seem to land up by talking about the normativity of rules as if these were coming out of the blue, you know. And I'm as suspicious as you are about purely rationalist foundations, but doesn't this reduce too much to, you know, merely pragmatic norms that we're no longer debating about in some way? And I think that tends to mainly possibly run into tension between another thrust of what you're saying, where it seems to me you're on the edge of saying, well, maybe human rights are not the most fundamental thing. And that would be my position, not that human rights have no place, but they're an integral part of a discourse of justice. That, you know, we can't really separate rights from duties. We can't really separate rights from the question of trying to have a just distribution. Otherwise, we can't really compare one right with each other. And I think that this is relevant again to what you're saying, that you're, you know, on the one hand, you're saying, okay, we've got this kind of discourse about freedom that is, as you put it, too aristocratic. It's trying to turn everybody into autonomous creatures. It's ignoring human weakness. On the other hand, we've got these political discourses about sufficiency that are more utilitarian, that are more about providing people with basic resources, which indeed they need to have rights. So on the one hand, it's as if you're saying, we think of people too actively. But then on the other hand, you say, we're thinking of people too passively. And I agree. And you're saying that in the middle, what's missing is the sort of texture of relationality in our lives, where actually, you know, people in theory have rights to liberty or rights to material well-being, but in reality, for various complicated reasons, they are traduced and subordinated by all the discourses and practices in which they're involved. So the attention then, I think, shifts to something like human relationality. But I think, from my point of view, you're not prepared to go all the way. That if you went all the way to a real personalism that is really about the priority of relation, then that would take you away from something like the priority of emancipation. Because I think not that emancipation is wrong, but that in the end, emancipation is still locked into the liberal discourses that you're trying to criticize. That in the end, emancipation is still just about trying to turn everybody either into aristocrats or into passive recipients of utilitarian benefits. And I think if we focus instead upon relationality, then what we see once more is the priority of the active citizen. That, you know, it's not that we can only fulfill our claim rights, if you like, first of all, if indeed governments and people in power have duties and honorably fulfill their duties, but also as if we have the sense that all of us continuously have duties to other people. In other words, I'm arguing for something like a recovery of the sense that we're all politicians, that we're all citizens. That it seems to me that's the only way to fix this area of densely textured relationality that you're talking about. And I think obviously, for me, that would also involve a kind of continuous debate, about what human flourishing really consists in, that would kind of transcend this duality of the ultimate value of freedom on the one hand, or the ultimate value of material happiness on the other hand, because life is about more than that. If we're talking about education, then we're talking about what is the point of human existence. We've got to think about whether we're religious or not. We've got to think about the human spiritual character and what really fulfills us psychically. So that I think that once you've shifted the debate towards what is justice, what are the fundamental correlated rights and duties, that you're then into a debate about, what should be really be aiming for, what is really fulfilling. And at that point, if you like, nothing is given. And the problem about dumping philosophy and ontology is that then you sort of reinforce this idea that it's all natural and obvious. And I think that idea that it's all natural and obvious is part of the problem of the liberal discourse about rights. It's not the solution. It's precisely close to the kind of thing that you really want to criticize, that it's just naturally obvious that we're free aristocratic individuals, or else we're passive, needy, pathetic individuals, and it locked into a kind of sort of diabolical collusion with each other, and missing our sense that we're both strong and weak. All of us as human beings are both strong and weak, and that's why we're relational, and we're both influential and dependent in a constant kind of network. And it's the question of trying to fix that network that I think requires us to see that human rights is, to be drastic, is a very secondary concern compared to the question of justice and distribution. So that's about all.
Great.
And I probably omitted a lot because
excellent. This is great. Thank you very much. There are loads of things to think about here, and so I will pick up on a few things, if I may.
Absolutely, yeah.
So on the moral person as foundation, of course you are right to say that you're always in danger of sort of constructing a straw man and then criticizing that whenever you're talking about these things, and that there are, of course, different ways of conceiving of the human person as the foundation of human rights, rather than the sort of rationalized picture that I concentrated on. But I think I am sort of even more fundamentally skeptical of invoking sort of an idea of the moral person as the carrier of value, be it apolitical or political, and various notions of portraying the human person as some sense sacred, as you put it.
Yeah.
I mean, certainly, and there are sort of two ways into that. I think first of all, the idea of the human person as reasonable, rational, and for that reason carrier of rights has historically actually been a resource for critical interventions. So I mean, if you look at the sort of the early feminists that I have been studied, where of course the sort of alleged universality of the moral standing of the human person as the foundation of human rights gave them a way to argue from the point of view of logic, you know, that excluding certain groups is simply illogical. It's not only unfair, but it's illogical considering the starting points of the whole theory. So historically, that has been really important for social movements, resistance movements, feminist movements, etc. So historically and politically, it has had a lot of purchase.
Yes.
Now, maybe that has sort of run its course. I'm not sure that it does have that political purchase anymore. A thing that I think that we could all worry about is whether the elevation of the human person to some kind of sacred carrier of rights now in our present concern, where the humanity's perception of itself as standing above all other concerns has caused havoc on our planet, and that perhaps what we don't need is another way for human beings to talk about themselves as standing above other concerns. That
would be
so that's another sort of reason for me to be skeptical of moralized notions of human beings as grounding human rights. So in that sense, also I second what you said about human rights being secondary. There's been secondary to many other concerns relating to climate change that really does affect our existential conditions, doesn't it?
Yes.
So another thing that you said, interestingly, about relationality, and I'm very sympathetic to that. I think that an interesting development in egalitarian discourse is what is sometimes referred to as relational egalitarianism. So the distributive paradigm is useful, but what it misses out is the fact that the distribution of resources is also a matter of distributing how we relate to each other in society. Equality is about relations and not only stuff. So I think that is really sort of important and worth exploring if we want to understand how equality impacts on people's lives in very subtle ways. Also, importantly, as I also attempted to stress, how not only inequality of resources but affects people's lives, but also how the fact that inequalities come with, perpetuate and create norms that make inequalities come across as just part of the natural workings of the world, and that criticizing them is criticizing sort of the. But I mean, the one worry that I have about relational egalitarianism is that it risks downplaying. You see this in some interventions into that debate, that it downplays the fact that material equality actually is also, I think, a much more important than some relational egalitarians would argue. That so I would emphasize sort of the materialism of human rights, that economic equality actually is quite crucial to the egalitarian project, and that we must not lose sight of that. So the And then another thing that you said concerning human rights as being secondary, I think that can sort of be theorized in different ways. And I think that one, you said secondary to questions of justice and distribution. I think I would rather say that human rights need to be integral to discussions about justice and distribution. And I think that one worry that I have, which is quite present, I think, in those human rights philosophies that talk about welfare rights on a sort of sufficiency level or threshold levels or cutoff points or whatever it is, what they often say is that, of course, economic inequalities can still be regarded as unjust, but they are unjust for other reasons. They're not unjust because they violate human rights. Human rights are about sort of the decent minimum, and inequalities above that we can still theorize as unjust, but we need to have other reasons for regarding that as if we can separate these things out. And I just think that is empirically uninformed. That there isn't a cutoff point where the sort of distribution of resources take on a different moral character and now impact some people's lives in completely different ways. So I think that distinction between rights fulfillment as a threshold question and distribution of resources as a sort of more systemic question proceeds on an artificial distinction between how that cannot be sustained empirically. So I don't think that there is a deep disagreement between us there. I just say that human rights have been insufficiently theorized as an integral component to what a theory of justice needs to account for, both in the sense of how it acts on distribution, but also in fact of how questions of justice need to relate to other concerns, including the impact of humans' perception of themselves as prior and superior on the state of the planet. That's me done. Thank you very much. That was really
thank you, Lena. Thank you.
John,
what happened?
Would you like to say something?
I'll just say some things very, very briefly. No, going backwards through the list, I accept that corrective that human rights is integrally part of an account of justice. And I would even say that it's sort of coextensive with the field of justice. In other words, I'm not somebody who's trying to say, well, rights only belong to a very narrow block. I think that in a sense they're diffused through everything. And I'll later say in my paper that I think Burke already had that sense. So that I think there's a certain gain in modernity of emphasizing a kind of claim aspect to justice, and that human rights is about that, so that human beings can legitimately make claims to fair treatment over housing and education and economic circumstances. But having said that, I think rights is, coextensive with the field of justice. I think the danger, Lena is worried about making the person foundational. I'm worried about making human rights foundational, because I think the danger of doing that, of sort of trying to derive justice from the claims of the individual, is that often you kind of let people off the hook. You say, well, it's the business of the suffering people to claim the rights, and you actually underrate the sense of the duty of those in power. So that it's quite right to insist on the dimension of active struggle, but there's a danger of downplaying the responsibility for people in power. And I think more recently, in the so-called woke generation, this has sort of tipped over into the idea that rights only emerge from a kind of subjective statement of experience. And while it's right to listen to people's experience, again, the danger is that that invites the reaction that, well, your experience is nothing to do with me. There must be some way of translating the experiential into terms that society will objectively recognize, I think, as worthy of attention. So that's why, very simply, I would want to insist on the correlation of rights and duties, even on a certain, in the end, priority of duty, because this is a sort of social, collective, categorical imperative towards justice, if you like, that in my mind has priority. And of course, the question of, you know, how far, what part has rights played in the history of, you know, for example, socialism, is now very strongly debated. And I think it has played some part, but probably not always the most fundamental part. For example, in the erection of the British welfare state, I don't think that rights was really the most fundamental consideration. On the question of relationality and materialism, well, in my account of the relational, it has to include a material dimension. And I agree that the problem with some forms of communitarianism is that they're sort of neglecting the economic and the material. That would definitely not be my position. Our relations are at once spiritual and material, if you like. But I think that trying to recover a more relational economy is absolutely crucial to having a participatory economy that's not a matter of either the pure neoliberal free market or kind of absolute state technocratic control. So I do think the relational is fundamental, and I think that a sense of gift exchange, and if you like, of charity. I don't see charity as this modern sort of notion of a sort of one-way giving. I think that historically, charity meant a condition of reciprocity between people. Even, for example, in Aquinas, that's what charity means. It's a sort of elevation of friendship. It's the attempt to base all of political society in the way, you know, in an Aristotelian tradition, ultimately on friendship. Very briefly about sort of feminism and rights. You know, well, this is your topic, but it does seem to me that Wollstonecraft interestingly already qualifies rights, that she's worried about the links of rights to the Burkean sublime and so on, and that she has more sense of you know, familial and community rooting than actually you know, the male theorists of political rights hitherto. So and then finally the question of you know of the human, that, well, this is too big a topic, but it does seem to me that, you know, we face the paradox that, okay, the damage to the planet has been done by humans, but only humans can fix this. So that it's human beings who have to ask themselves, well, what is the value of nature? What is the value of human life? How are these things supposed to operate together? And there's a sense in which we simply can't escape our human personhood. We can't escape the fact that we only perceive nature through our human consciousness and interaction. So to some extent, we can't escape something like a human analogy. And therefore, you know, our valuing of animals and even plants and trees is not totally removed from that human analogy. Just as inversely, I think a correct understanding of who we are as human beings mustn't forget our link to rocks and plants and trees and other animals, the way we are locked into the universe, if you like. And
speaking of which,
that will be all. Yeah.
speaking of which, we are moving into the lunch. And
yes, sorry.
Lena, I would have liked
coffee break, but yeah, yes, in England, yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
You will have a chance to reply tomorrow in the debate.
Yes, yes, of course.
Good, okay, yeah. Sorry about that.
And with that, we reconvene at 1:30.
Yes.
After the lunch break.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot
to everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.